welcome everybody and make some noise for Soul Asylum.
The grunge and alternative rock explosion of the 90s had its fair share of superstars writing self-defeating lyrics to the point of self-destruction. Now that may be a gross oversimplification, but you can't deny that there weren't exactly many songs about rainbows to be found in the rock world during that time. Angst was in, and positivity was out. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, it's just how it was. But even in the most dour times, there were still beacons of hope. One of them was Soul Asylum, who after toiling away in the punk underground for a decade, they finally broke through in 1993 with their smash album Grave Dancers Union and their hit single Runaway Train, an aching ballad that had a music video that featured pictures of missing kids very prominently and acted as a PSA for runaway children. But to truly understand a Runaway Train and the band who wrote it, we need to go back to the beginning. The band were formed in 1981, originally as a hardcore band called Loud Fast Rules. They eventually got sick of the hardcore scene because they felt it was too limiting. Drummer and vocalist Dave Pirner moved to rhythm guitar as the frontman, and they changed their name to Soul Asylum. In the band's early days, they looked up to and were heavily influenced by the Replacements and Husker Du, both legends of the Twin Cities music scene. In fact, you can even hear a young Dave Pirner on the 1982 Replacements EP Stink yelling at a cop.
This is the Minneapolis police. The party is over.
And Husker Du almost took Soul Asylum under their wing, by frontman Bob Mould producing their first two Twin Tone released albums, and they opened for the Huskers on their Flip Your Wig tour in '85. They gained quite a reputation in their early years. They would tour constantly and disgrace any stage they played, with a unique mix of hardcore punk, country, and hard rock. And even though they played a vicious enough set to hang with any hardcore band of the time, there was a tenderness about them, from their unmistakably Midwest appearance to their jovial stage presence. As writer Steve Hockman said in a review for the band in one of their early shows in the LA Times, Soul Asylum sounds like some unholy mix of Kiss and Hank Williams thrown under the wheels of a runaway train. After two albums and a few years in the classic indie label Twin Tone, the band caught the eye of major label A&M and signed with them in 1988, following a trend of their influences signing to major labels when they got the chance. In fact, on the band's last release with Twin Tone, the EP Clam Dip and Other Delights, the title and album cover were a parody of the album Whipped Cream and Other Delights released on A&M. The label they would soon be with. And the two albums the band released on A&M, Hang Time and Then the Horse They Rode In On, are considered classic records by fans of the band, and they yielded some of the band's most defining songs, like Cartoon, Sometime to Return, and Easy Street. But despite being critical darlings, these albums didn't sell very well at all. Both of them failed to chart in any markets, and according to Rolling Stone, the album and The Horse They Rode In On only sold about 70,000 copies. So after two flop albums, A&M dropped the band, and they considered calling it quits. They'd been going on for a decade, and they just couldn't catch a break. And considering roughly a decade was the usual lifespan for a Twin Cities alternative band, it would be understandable. Principal songwriter Dave Pirner was in a very depressed state, and after years of relentless touring and ridiculously loud volumes, he had started to develop hearing problems, which led him to reach for the acoustic guitar more whilst writing, which is something he had never really done before at this point in his career. Also at this time, he was influenced by more folk and country artists like Woody Guthrie and Leonard Cohen. Pirner later pointed out the irony of how at first in the band's inception, they were writing the fastest and harshest material they possibly could to keep up with the hardcore bands, but by the early 90s, they were writing the slowest and most melodic material they could. They capitalized off this by playing some acoustic shows, and they managed to pick up another major label deal from Columbia Records after the alternative explosion left by Nevermind. And this time, Soul Asylum had a fighting chance. When we think of the early 90s music scene, there's a lot more to think about besides grunge. There was huge pop hits from Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince. Pop rappers like MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice were tearing up the charts. Gangster rap was gaining more relevance as it slowly took over the world. And there was still the back end of hair metals reigning from the previous decade. And even though most people will point to grunge as the sound of rock music in the early 90s, it wasn't the most cohesive genre of music. It was hard to find two bands who sounded very much alike, even though most of them had the same influences like Black Sabbath, Big Star, the Pixies, Cheap Trick, or the Beatles. And Soul Asylum at this point were getting rootsier, and they weren't afraid to dial it back a notch when most other bands were cranking up their distortion pedals to infinity. Very much ahead of the game when you think about it. It was way before the adult alternative scene got big in the mid to late 90s. Their first album on Columbia, Grave Dancers Union, would prove to be a difficult recording experience, as producer Michael Beinhorn Beinhorn was dissatisfied with Grant Young's drumming and enlisted session drummer Sterling Campbell to play on at least half the tracks, including what would soon become the band's biggest hit. This obviously caused some friction since Grant had been in the band since 1984, and after the Gravedancers Union tour, he was let go and was replaced by Campbell permanently. Beinhorn had this to say about Grant's abilities in 2013. "We had done a lot of work in pre-production, and everyone seemed very confident when we began tracking. Grant was playing as well as he could, his takes had a lot of character, and suited the recordings perfectly. The results were good and spirits were high. But about 5 songs into the recording, something started to change with Grant's performances. It was like as if the wind had been knocked out of his sails. Everything he did felt lackluster. It felt like he'd either lost his resolve or was getting worn out." Campbell also noted that the drums he had to use for the sessions were really loosely tuned, and they were really hard to play, which probably had a lot to do with the fact that Grant was having such a tough time. But they had the sound that Beinhorn wanted, so they used them. And Campbell said that it was a really awkward experience because he really felt for Grant, and he would feel awful if he was in a similar situation. Grant had this to say in 1995. "We'd always argued. I'd be known to fuck things up, and we'd have arguments about music sometimes because our philosophies about music or ideas about what we thought was good music were often very different. I often thought it was one of the interesting things in the band because there were 4 different guys that had different ideas about what good music is. The coming together of all those different styles is what gave Soul Asylum a personality. It's like they got to a point that they could afford one of the greatest players around. It's musical arrogance, and that's disappointing as hell." To this day, Dave Pirner and guitarist Dan Murphy say that they're saddened by their strained relationship with Grant. It's a shame, but these things unfortunately happen. And that wasn't the only issue they had while recording. Dave's vocal tracks was an obstacle because he felt uncomfortable once he started recording with Michael Beinhorn there, and the engineers and anybody else in the room, so it was decided that the vocal tracks would be recorded completely isolated. With only Dave and Dan in the room, Dan being there to man the machine so Dave wouldn't have to multitask, and most of the vocals for the album were recorded this way. When Gravedancers Union was finally released in October of '92, it was doing well thanks to its first 2 singles. The first being Somebody to Shove, a classic alt-rock song that encapsulates a feeling of longing and loneliness, and Black Gold, written about the Gulf War in Iraq, which is a great political protest song, which is something Soul Asylum had never really done previously. And fun fact, the videos for Somebody to Shove and Black Gold were both directed by Zack Snyder. Just thought you'd like to know. And when they got to perform in Letterman in very early '93, they played what would end up becoming the 4th and final single from Gravedancers Union, the folk rocker Without a Trace. And even though the band was doing decently well, the best they had ever done in their entire career, they weren't exactly topping any charts until the 3rd single, Runaway Train, was released in mid-1993, and the band became an overnight sensation. Only 12 years after they were formed. And the song's meaning is a little confusing since people watch the video, which is incredible and powerful, and assume the song, like the video, is about missing and runaway children. But it isn't quite, even though it can definitely be interpreted that way, especially if you only pay attention to the chorus.
Runaway train, never going back. Wrong way on a one-way track. Seems like I should be getting somewhere.
But when you pay attention to the verses, it becomes clear that this song was actually written about Pirner's struggle with depression.
Can you help me remember how to smile? Make it somehow all seem worthwhile. How on earth did I get so jaded? Life's mystery seems so faded.
Pirner said that he had the melody for the song a couple years before he wrote the lyrics that would make it on the album, and during his darkest hour when the band were at rock bottom and they almost split up, he had the lyrics, and it would end up being the defining song of their career. Dan Murphy said this about the beginnings of the song years later. "We played it at the University of Minnesota, and our manager at the time was like, that's the one that's going to change your band. Our manager said he walked around the room and watched people, and they initially thought it was a cover because it sort of sounded like a classic song, and it was a complete rebirth of the band. And Dave Pirner as a songwriter. Remember, he was a scrappy punk kid from the Twin Cities who had never touched an acoustic guitar in his life, and he went from writing loud rockers on their previous records to now writing something that is almost embarrassingly naked and personal, and it would shape much of the band's material to come. Which I'm sure there are people quick to call them sellouts for this, but those people aren't worth having around anyway. The song itself is daringly simple, almost never leaving 4 main open cowboy chords besides a short-lived pre-chorus, but it's what they do with those chords that make this song powerful. Throughout the entire song, there's nice and pretty flourishes of more acoustic guitar, a brief but powerful bass break just before the second verse hits at exactly the right time. There's a beautiful interlude that features legendary session musician Booker T. Jones on a Hammond organ, and right afterwards there's a sparing bridge that sounds like Dave is about to break down crying. Then it hits with the last chorus with slightly altered lyrics that reinforces a feeling of utter hopelessness.
Runaway train never coming back. Runaway train tearing up the track. Runaway train burning in my veins. I run away, but it always seems the same.
It was a big consensus from Columbia that Runaway Train would be a big hit, but I don't think they were expecting it to be as big as it was. Dan Murphy said this in 2012. You've got to think about that point in history. It was right after Nirvana had just gotten huge, and it was all really aggressive guy rock. And this was kind of the antithesis of aggressive guy rock.
It's just easier than dealing with the pain.
And of course, a big reason why Runaway Train was as big as it was because the song was much bigger than the band, and that was due to its video, which people almost remember more than the song itself. It's iconic. It was directed by Tony Kaye, who would later direct the film American History X. The band said that they clicked with him within seconds, and since he had such a vision for the video, I can see why. Pirner said that they came up to them and just said, "Milk cartons. Pictures of kids on milk cartons. We're going to find them." To which Pirner responded with, "Okay, let's do this." Tony Kaye later said, "It was quite brave of them to say yes to it, because it positioned it as a sort of public service announcement, which it wasn't. It was always a music video, and that's why I thought it would be effective, because kids would see it, and if they had run away from home and been missing, it might jar them into thinking, maybe I should go back, because it was a cool music video." In different countries, they would put pictures of different kids, and it ended with a PSA of Dave saying,
If you've seen one of these kids, or you are one of them, please call this number.
Donnie Lenner, who's the president of Columbia Records at the time, asked them to at least have one chorus of just Dave singing, to which Tony Kaye responded with, "No." In fact, at first the label wanted to re-edit the video a bunch to put more footage of the band in, but they kept saying no and to give it time, and in the end, 26 kids from around the world came back home. Though unfortunately, many of the cases ended tragically. Dan Murphy said in 2006, "Some weren't the best scenarios. I met a fireman on the East Coast whose daughter was at the end of the video, and he'd been in a bitter custody battle with his wife over her. It turned out the girl hadn't run away, but was killed and buried in her backyard by her mother. Then on another tour, another girl told us laughingly, 'You ruined my life,' because she saw herself on the video at her boyfriend's house, and it led her to being forced back into a bad home situation." And there's unfortunately a lot of cases where the kids featured in the different versions of the video were found to be dead, and many are still missing to this very day. The band were also accused of taking advantage of these missing kids to further their careers, to which Pirner responded with, "People's reactions were fascinating. I guess I could go, gosh, I could have seemed questionable, but I never had time to think, does this look like we're trying to take advantage of the situation? Because I wasn't. It was the furthest thing from my brain. In my mind, it was a completely righteous and politically correct mission. I mean, you can barely be a dick about missing children, I defy you." After Gravedancers Union went out, the band went on a huge arena tour with the Screaming Trees and the Spin Doctors. They became very involved with centers for missing children, and the band are still connected with them to this very day. They played the first inauguration of Bill Clinton, and they even won a Grammy for Best Rock Song for Runaway Train. But most of the band didn't attend the ceremony, saying that you can't really say someone's song is better than someone else's. Dan Murphy did go, but he didn't want to sit in a seat because he didn't want to be filmed or accept the award if they did win, so Meatloaf accepted it in their absence. They followed it up with the album Let Your Dim Light Shine, produced by Butch Vig, which produced another big hit for the band with Misery. But then the alternative rock and grunge scene by 1998 had been milked dry, and their next album, Candy from a Stranger, was nowhere near as successful as their previous two albums, and the band and Columbia parted ways for good afterwards. Since then, the band have released a handful of albums for a small but loyal group of hardcore fans, and in the years since, they've slowly but surely lost every member of their original lineup until only Dave Pirner remains. Bassist Cole Mueller sadly died of cancer in 2005, and lead guitarist Dan Murphy left in 2012. In the years since Runaway Train, no one ever really forgot about it. With a video like that, it's pretty hard to forget, though for many years the band refused to perform it live, but they eventually added it back to their set lists. Pirner had this to say about the ordeal years later. "Why would I want to deprive anybody of that? It turned into this show business reality for me when I was like, I'm not going to play this song anymore. All anybody wanted to talk about was why I wasn't playing that song. So about 8 minutes into my explanation, after I'd done this 100 times, I went, I could have saved myself half that time by actually playing the song. I mean, it's kind of understandable for some artists to grow a dislike for their big hits, but at a certain point, it's easier to just play the song and make everyone happy, instead of just dying on a hill of never playing it again. In the years since, there's been several covers, and in 2019, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children invited some artists to do a new version of the song, and the video for it also included pictures of new missing children. And the proceeds of the cover were donated to the previously mentioned organization. And I'll be honest and say that I'm not really a fan of this new version, but I'm glad it exists since it's for a good cause. It's been nearly 30 years since Runaway Train was released, and it's just as important today as it was in 1993. An estimated 8 million children are reported missing each year, and that figure only increases as time goes on. And even though the song and video didn't solve this crisis, it brought a lot of awareness to it, and I think the world is a little bit of a better place with Runaway Train than without it. If you enjoy this video, you can click the links on screen for more, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell in order to remain notified and to support the channel. But anyways, take it easy, party people.